Greetings, comrades! Although my channel is about Russia, we often talk about the American dream. And the American dream of success goes hand in hand with dirty green papers. If you didn't get rich, didn't become a millionaire, can you even be counted as successful? Millionaires. Such a capitalist concept. People who oppress the working class for the sake of endless and meaningless profit. This could only happen in the West, across the ocean. Here in the Soviet Union there were no millionaires. They weren't, were they? The concept of the Soviet millionaire first appeared in the novel The Golden Calf by Ilic and Petrov. I highly recommend it, by the way. The entire plot revolves around the great swindler Ostap Bender and his accomplices learning about the untold riches of an ordinary Soviet citizen named Koreika and deciding to get their hands on them at any cost. They used various methods. For example, one of them ran after Koreika and shouted, "Give me a million." But did satirists invent this image, or did it have real-life counterparts? Let's clarify right away. Are we talking about those who owned millions of rubles, or those who lived as if they did? If the latter, then the party elite certainly belonged to this category. Stalin with his dachas, Beria with his mansion, or Brezhnev with his apartment covering an entire floor. Formally, all of this belonged to the state, but everyone was aware of the truth. Today we will talk about the former, those who somehow managed to accumulate enormous and usually illegal wealth. How was this even possible in a country of universal equality? Did the authorities know about it, and how did they respond? Finally, did these millionaires even have the opportunity to spend their money? First, let's talk about the official elite. In the USSR, famous film directors, actors, writers, athletes and singer-songwriters were very well paid. Lydia Ruslanova, for example, was a popular singer during Stalin's time and a real millionaire who collected diamonds. Rumor had it that she initially carried her jewels in her bra. Her friends joked, "Isn't it time to wash the safe?" Experts estimated that Lyudmila Zykina's jewelry collection was worth millions. Chess player Anatoly Karpov earned 33,000 rubles a month, an incredible sum for those times. Circus artist Natalia Durova had apartments in Moscow and Paris, expensive cars and works of art. Her collection even included blue diamonds that once belonged to Catherine the Great. Outside of pop stars and athletes, the most notable legal millionaire in the Soviet Union was Vadim Tumanov, a famous prospector. The hotels he established in the 1960s and 1970s worked from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean and brought the Soviet Union over 500 tons of gold. His workers received salaries 5 to 6 times higher than elsewhere, but they also worked 12 hours a day for 8 months. Tumanov lived like a king. Directors of large markets, department stores and restaurants were in a similar position, but they did not flaunt their wealth. That would have caused a scandal. In the late 1980s, the name Artyom Tarasov was on everyone's lips. He announced on television that he earned 3 million rubles per month. For comparison, the average monthly salary in the USSR in 1989 was 263 rubles. After that, half of the population demanded he be shot, while the other half wanted him to become prime minister. How did this happen? In 1988, the law on cooperation in the USSR permitted private cooperatives to hire employees and engage in trade. Tarasov seized the opportunity by opening the Technika cooperative, which specialized in repairing imported devices. The business turned out to be extremely profitable. In 1989, when rumors reached Tarasov that the government had decided to switch all cooperatives to cashless payments, he realized his cash-based business would collapse. At that time, Technika had approximately 100 million rubles in its accounts. But they found a loophole in the law on cooperation. It did not limit salary size. Tarasov wrote himself and his deputy checks for 3 million rubles each. After paying 180,000 rubles in taxes to the state, he legalized the money. Naturally, representatives of the Ministry of Finance, the police, the prosecutor's office and the KGB immediately descended to his offices with numerous inspections, but the accounting records were perfect. Nevertheless, according to Tarasov, he could have faced imprisonment under Article 93 for large-scale embezzlement and, in the worst-case scenario, execution. To save himself and the cooperative, he decided to appear on national television and explain how the cooperative had earned the money. In the end, he said that if they proved he was a speculator, he was ready to be shot, even on Red Square. In the following days, many Soviet and foreign media outlets published articles about him. It became somewhat awkward to shoot a media personality. Thanks to the publicity, he was elected to the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR and became untouchable, completely avoiding criminal prosecution. From the state's point of view, however, all his schemes were extremely shady. For example, to repair imported equipment, he would open it up, replace the parts with domestic ones, since imported parts were almost impossible to obtain, and sell the original parts for 5 times the price. There were no complaints, the equipment worked, but it sounds like theft. Of course, Tarasov was unique only in that he openly proclaimed his wealth. There were dozens of cunning cooperative leaders in the late 1980s, but that was during the decline of the USSR. What about during its heyday? Did anyone pull off something like that under Stalin's nose, for example? Of course. There are very polarized opinions about the effectiveness of the centralized command and control economy that Stalin created in the 1930s. This system excelled at solving large-scale problems, whether conquering the North, creating space technology, or producing new types of weapons. However, the situation was much worse when it came to producing consumer goods. If the official market does not satisfy people's needs, what happens? That's right, black market happens. If there was a black market, then there were also its heroes, underground millionaires. This is not a figment of Ilf and Petrov's imagination. Underground millionaires were a reality that the Soviet system fought fiercely against, but ultimately failed to eradicate. Perhaps the only thing writers got wrong was the typical millionaire's lifestyle. Koreyka lived quietly and avoided attracting attention, waiting for the collapse of Soviet power. Genuine Soviet millionaires, even in those conditions, often lived in such a way that even the official elite of that time would envy them. They can be divided into 2 groups, fartsovshchiki and tsekhoviki. The fartsovshchiki resold scarce, often imported goods, while the tsekhoviki organized the underground production of these goods. It should be noted that being an illegal wealthy person in the USSR was extremely dangerous. Smuggling, possession of foreign currency, and private enterprise were all criminal offenses punishable by death sometimes. However, the profits outweighed the risks. In fact, the first millionaires appeared in the USSR during the NEP period of the 1920s. However, Stalin won the power struggle within the Soviet leadership and the NEP was rolled back. Collectivization and industrialization started. It would seem that private business should have been eliminated and those involved in it sent to dig canals. But oddly enough, this did not happen. Even during the harshest years of the 1930s-1950s, artels and individual kustari, essentially small and very small businesses, flourished. Of course, kustari, as alien and questionable class elements, were under the close supervision of the authorities, but they were not actually eliminated. By the end of the 1950s, there were about 150,000 such small businesses in the USSR. Formally, they were supposed to operate using only the waste products of large enterprises. But behind this smokescreen were ordinary small businesses, workshops for sewing clothes, making shoes, and so on. It was impossible to keep track of the tens of thousands of small-scale production facilities across the country. Consequently, entire sectors and industries operated outside the legal, official planned economy. It was there, mainly in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where central authority was weaker and it was always possible to negotiate with local authorities, that the first illegal millionaires appeared. Sometimes black market products were manufactured from saved materials on the premises of a Soviet factory during off hours, and sometimes entire production facilities were set up in abandoned hangars. After their shift ended, factory workers would go to these illegal workshops, where they could earn several times their official salary. This arrangement seemed harmless enough, and for a while the USSR turned a blind eye to it. However, when some began to openly abuse their position, the government took action. Siegfried Gazenfranz, for example. He and his partner, Zinga, obtained Czechoslovakian weaving looms and raw materials from relatives in Romania. They set up a weaving factory in abandoned military hangars and sold the product through their own channels and stores. Gus in France lived in a luxurious house, his wife wore diamonds, and the entrepreneur himself drove a Rolls-Royce purchased from foreign diplomats around the city of Frunze, now Bishkek. Zinga loved to take vacations in the Baltic states, where he would arrange real champagne baths for his mistresses. The local authorities turned a blind eye to the partner's activities, having received generous bribes. However, eventually, rumors about their extravagant spending reached Moscow. In 1962, the entire network of more than 150 people was arrested. Gus in France, Zinga, and 12 other underground Soviet entrepreneurs were executed. Boris Roifman, the workshop manager who, while working in Tver at an enterprise belonging to the All-Union Society of the Deaf and Mute in the 1950s, realized that their labor could be exploited illegally. After all, they wouldn't tell anyone. He later moved to Moscow and, with the help of Shai Shakerman, built an entire underground empire. Their factory was worse than Gus in France. Disabled people worked 3 shifts on 58 machines installed not only in workshops, but also in the basements of neighboring houses. They received nothing for their work except food. Essentially, it was slave labor. The enterprise collapsed because of Shakerman. After his wife died, he began an affair with her married sister. A few months later, the woman returned to her husband and shared her lover's business secrets with him. He reported them to the KGB, and both tsekhoviki were shot. The biggest case involving such millionaires was the so-called fur case. During an investigation into a series of robberies in the 1970s, strange fur coats were found on a suspect. The coats were high quality but lacked the mandatory GOST and price tags. It turned out that a lawyer named Dunaev had organized the production. Excellent fur was delivered to his workshop under the guise of defective goods, which were written off as livestock losses. Of course, this was covered up by high-ranking police officers. However, nothing lasts forever, and in 1974 the free ride ended. During Operation Cartel, more than 500 people were arrested and millions of rubles and hundreds of kilograms of jewelry were seized. Dunaev and his accomplices were, that's right, shot. In general, many tsekhoviks had a common problem. They had nowhere to put their money. It got to the point of absurdity. In the late 1960s, the police seized the front door of a Volga car made of gold from a businessman in Simferopol. It was allegedly broken and never opened. Perhaps the most unusual millionaire was Nikolai Pavlenko. In 1941, he deserted from the Red Army and, taking advantage of the chaos, created a non-existent military unit, UVSR-5, using false documents. By the end of the war, the unit had 200 other deserters. UVSR-5 carried out construction work for the army under various contracts and reached Berlin, where it looted so much that it took a train with 30 cars to transport it all. After the war, Pavlenko moved to Lvov, then to Kishinev, where he organized the first military construction administration, UVS-1. The organization soon became one of the largest construction organizations in the region, receiving contracts throughout the Soviet Union. The enterprise had its own armed security, and its personnel came from local military registration and enlistment offices. The funny thing is that since Pavlenko paid 3 to 4 times more than state-owned enterprises, his subordinates did a very good job. Even the investigators who handled the Pavlenko case later admitted as much. The gang was only exposed when Pavlenko scammed one of the workers. By that time, Pavlenko was already a colonel and was found with suitcases containing 34 million rubles. Pavlenko was sentenced to death, and 17 other members of the group received lengthy prison sentences. Interestingly, Pavlenko and his accomplices were tried for creating an anti-Soviet organization rather than economic crimes. Why? Because under Stalin such crimes were punishable by up to 15 years in a labor camp only. It was Khrushchev who introduced the death penalty for them. When? Right after the case of our next hero. You're probably wondering about the fartsovshchiki I mentioned. They appeared in large numbers after the 6th World Festival of Youth and Students, which took place in Moscow in 1957. In response to workers' desire to dress stylishly and originally after seeing foreigners, resourceful young people quickly established an illegal trade with foreign tourists. The most prominent figure in this field was Jan Rokotov. He was the first to create a well-organized, structured system with its own hierarchy, laws, and a complex scheme of intermediaries for buying currency and goods from foreigners. Rokotov started building his empire in 1957. By 1959, he had become an underground millionaire. To secure his business, Rokotov became a police informant, betraying his competitors and sometimes even his subordinates. Incidentally, unlike most of his colleagues, Jan led a modest lifestyle. He lived in a small communal apartment and carried nearly all of his wealth in a suitcase. He often left it at his friends' apartments, and they had no idea of the riches it contained. It is unclear how long this would have continued if it weren't for the intervention of high politics. During Khrushchev's trip to West Berlin, in response to the Soviet leader's words, "Berlin had turned into a dirty swamp of speculation," someone in the audience shouted, "There is no black market like yours in Moscow anywhere else in the world." Enraged, Khrushchev ordered the eradication of black market trading. In 1961, Rokotov and his accomplices were arrested and approximately $1.5 million was seized during the search of Rokotov's home. Rokotov's underground empire had a total turnover of 20 million rubles. According to the law, they faced a maximum of 8 years in prison. However, Khrushchev was not satisfied with that. The case was reviewed, a new law was passed for this specific purpose, and Rokotov was sentenced to 15 years. But even that was not enough for the General Secretary. He wanted blood. The criminal code was changed again to allow the death penalty for speculation. The sentence was overturned a second time, and the Supreme Court handed down the final verdict: death by execution. 3 heads of the underground trading empire were shot that same year. So, this was the life of millionaires in the USSR. It was very attractive, yet incredibly dangerous. Millionaires were occasionally consumed by the Soviet regime's repressive machinery. Again, I'm only telling you about those who were caught and prosecuted as public examples. How many escaped punishment by paying bribes or using their connections? By 1987, more than 6,000 people had been executed for economic crimes in the USSR, but new people immediately replaced those who had been shot. Indeed, it was believed that people in the Soviet Union did not value money as much as we do today. However, as you can see, when everyone around you is roughly equal in terms of income and opportunities, the desire to stand out sometimes becomes irresistible. Thanks for watching. As always, please leave a like, a comment, maybe some suggestions for my next videos. And a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta, Zakharova, Kirill, Klimuk, Böse, Jimmy Elbin, Petar, Ilic, Marina, Holiday, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.